Welcome, everyone. My name is Shelley Cardenas. I am MTA's Education Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to MTA Q&A, the impact of Prop 18 and COVID-19 on elections. This free hour-long webinar will adjourn around 1 o'clock today. It's also being recorded so that others may watch and learn from the discussion and your questions. The recorded version will be made available in both video and audio-only format for those of you who have trouble streaming video. We're going to be giving our panelists time to share their wisdom before turning to your questions today. Here's some quick tips on how to ask a question. Use your mouse to hover over the bar at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a chat option. Click chat to open that window. Simply type in your question and then use enter to submit. Be sure to choose the drop-down attendees and panelists when submitting your questions. That way everyone can see what was asked. That will help us eliminate duplicate questions and allow us to get through as many as possible. If you called in today, you're not going to be able to see or use that chat feature. So if you do have a question, I ask that you text that to me at 517-234-5704. Be sure to include your name and your township in the text. And remember, this method is only for those of you participating via phone. That number again, 517-234-5704. And so let's get right to it. It's my pleasure to introduce your experts from the Michigan Department of State Bureau of Elections. With us today, we have Jonathan Brater, Director, Bureau of Elections, Lori Bourbonnais, Manager of the Elections Liaison Section, Sally Marsh, Director of Special Projects in the Executive Office, and Sarah Reinhardt, who's an analyst with Special Projects and the engine behind the Democracy MVP machine. Following the presentation, we'll have feedback and questions from MTA's own Cindy Dodge, Member Information Services Liaison, a familiar face to all of you, I'm sure. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to our experts. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you, MTA, for having us with you this afternoon. I'm going to, well, first let me just say thanks again, and I'm going to spend some time going through the topic that we're going to cover today, which is, of course, the impact of Proposal 2018-3 and the impact of COVID-19 on our elections, both in August and November. I'm going to turn over to Sally Marsh towards the end to talk a little bit about a specific program that we're asking you to help with, which is the poll worker recruitment through Democracy MVP. But we have a deep bench, as Shelley indicated, that can help answer additional questions that you all have after that, of which I'm sure there will be some. So I'm going to hopefully successfully share my screen with you all now to get into my slides. So again, the main topics that we're going to cover today are 2018-3 and COVID-19. It's unfortunate that those are both numbered items, because obviously they're very different, one being a voter-approved constitutional amendment and one being a terrible pandemic, but both of them are having a major impact on our elections and in some ways interact with each other to make it more difficult, frankly, in a lot of ways for our clerks to administer elections going into August and November. So we're going to talk about, first I'm just going to give a very quick background on our election system. I think most of you are probably familiar with the basic elements of that, but just as a starting point. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what changed going into this two-year election cycle because of Proposal 2018-3, followed by how that's all been changed yet again by COVID-19. And then I want to spend a good amount of time, and Sally will as well, talking about how townships can really support their election officials and their voters as we continue to successfully hold elections in this environment. So first of all, just a basic, overview of how elections work in Michigan. I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with this, but we do have a very decentralized election system in Michigan. We have local clerks that run our elections for the most part. So we have 1,520 election jurisdictions. Other than Wisconsin, we're the only state like this that's such a large state geographically and by population, that has so many different election officials running things. That has a lot of major benefits in terms of election officials knowing their communities better and having more customer service and on-the-ground interaction. But it also makes election administration statewide a challenge, especially when we need to coordinate efforts in response to unexpected circumstances like COVID-19. So we are the largest state, that being Michigan, in terms both of geography and in population, to have this kind of decentralized system. City and township clerks do the vast majority of election functions. They set up polling places, they handle absentee ballots, they handle voter registration for the most part. With the support of their local election boards, they hire poll workers. They are the ones dealing with and responding and assisting to voters in response to questions. They do a lot of candidate filing on local issues. So the vast majority of election functions, if you look at every minute of every day that are spent on elections, are done by local clerks. It's really a locally run system. And of course, that means that all of the challenges and changes that have come about mostly fall on local clerks to administer. County clerks, though, do play an important role in our election system as well. It's not all locally run in every facet. So the county clerks typically are responsible for purchasing and distributing election equipment through our election and management vendors, things like voting machines. They also play a really important role in the canvass process. That's an important check and balance in our system. Before the state canvass, it's done by the county. And in a lot of places, the county clerks are directly involved in the training of poll workers and sometimes helping their local clerks as well. It depends a little bit on the size of the county and the size of the municipality, but in many cases, the county clerks play a very active role in that as well. So certainly it is a partnership between local and county officials, although it is a primarily local run system. And then the state provides oversight and support over all of this. So the Secretary of State is the chief election officer for the state of Michigan. The Bureau of Elections does primarily, effectuates that through election policies. A lot of what the Bureau does involves training and guidance that we provide to local and county clerks, sometimes directly to voters and candidates. We create forms for voter registration, absent voter ballots, and all sorts of other election-related forms. We enforce the election law when necessary, and we also do play a role in distributing equipment and a lot of the infrastructure that supports the election system. Most importantly, the state administers and provides support for the qualified voter file, which is our voter registration list on the statewide level, but also is really increasingly become the backbone of our election system and how it's run. So when the qualified voter file was first created, it was primarily just a statewide voter registration list, but obviously over the last 20 years, as things have become much more computer-based, more and more of our functions for how we run elections, including the poll book on election day and a lot of other tools, are run electronically. So our role in supporting and administering and improving the qualified voter file is increasingly an important part of how we interact with clerks. So Proposal 2018-3 changed things pretty significantly. It didn't change the basic approach or structure of our election system, but it did make some pretty large-scale changes to the way elections work, and specifically the way voter registration and voting work. It was a ballot initiative, so it was passed by the voters on the 2018 ballot in November, took effect the next month. It did amend our state constitution. So it is now, the provisions of Proposal 2018-3 are now in our state constitution in Article 2, Section 4. And it took effect actually in December of 2018, but the first election that it was really there affecting was in May 2019. So we've had some practice running our elections under these new proposals. We sort of ramped up for May 2019, August and November 2019. Obviously we had a high turnout presidential primary in March. And then this is, yet another, we also had a local election in May, which was quite unique, which I'll touch on in a bit. And then, now we're wrapping up for August and November of this year. So, we are starting to get familiar with how elections run under Proposal 2018-3, but each election is different. And so, the real test will, of course, be November of 2020 when we have, the highest turnout. So the changes that are brought about by 2018-3 primarily, for the most part, have to do with how absentee voting works and how voter registration works. There's also some other provisions which I'll touch on, but the biggest changes both for voters and election officials have to do with, the ability to vote by mail essentially, and changes to the way you can register to vote. So I'm going to go through a couple of those changes. One of the big changes in Proposal 2018-3 was automatic voter registration. This is something that actually, frankly, affected the Department of State more than local clerks. I mentioned previously that for the most part, local clerks are responsible for voter registration. This is an area where the state has a direct role because a lot of people, in fact, most people in Michigan, register through the Secretary of State for the most part when they get their driver's license or state ID, but also people will just come into the Secretary of State branch offices to register to vote. That was already in place before 2018-3. We actually already had a really good motor voter system in Michigan, which was one of the real models for the country. We were one of the first states to really do that well, combine the ability to register to vote when you get your driver's license. But automatic voter registration sort of amped that up a little bit by making it automatic. What that basically means is it's now opt-out unless the customer is, if the customer is eligible. So as long as the customer is a citizen and otherwise meets the eligibility requirements, now when you get your driver's license or state ID or renew it, you're going to be registered unless you say no. So basically, instead of having an additional voter registration form, you now get a form that says, hey, we're going to register you to vote unless you say no. So that has increased the number of people who are registering at the branches. Also, this was not part of Proposal 2018-3, but I mention it because it's very similar, is through legislation, we also had online voter registration passed in 2018. So that also is connected to our Secretary of State system. You have to have a driver's license to utilize it. So both of those things have meant an increasing amount of voter registration, which already was primarily done through the Secretary of State, is now coming through us. So that generally does help efficiency. I think it's helped boost voter registration numbers overall. But for clerks, the major benefit is clerks still get voter registration in other ways, like in person and through the mail. But the increasing registration that's happened well before Election Day has taken that off the clerks a little bit. Also, the real benefit in terms of efficiency is that these are all transactions where the voter is already providing all the information that they need to assess their eligibility and register them in an electronic format. So we're essentially importing their data from the driver's license database into the qualified voter file. And that really cuts down on things like typos. It cuts down on missing information or mismatched information. It helps us sort of keep a more clean and up-to-date voter file. So that also helps the clerks because it means that they're dealing with fewer registration-related problems both before and on Election Day. The other issue with voter registration, though, that was changed and does directly affect clerks in a very significant way are changes to voter registration deadlines as part of Proposal 2018-3. So before 2018-3, we had a 30-day book closing in Michigan. It was actually one of the farthest out before Election Day in the country registration deadlines. So until 2018-3 was passed, the deadline to register to vote was 30 days before the election. So essentially early October for a November election, the books are closed. So if you don't register by then, you aren't able to vote. And so that was changed to Proposal 2018-3. You can actually now register up through Election Day, but it's a little more complicated. So the deadline for registering has moved from day 30 up to day 15 using any method of registration you could previously use. So whether that be at the Secretary of State, as I just touched on, by mail, at a county clerk's office, you can register also at public assistance offices like Department of Health and Human Services. Any of those methods of voter registration, which used to have a 30-day cutoff, you can now do up to 15 days. In addition to that, though, you can actually still register all the way up through Election Day, starting in the 14th day before the election and up through Election Day itself. You can still register to vote, but you can only do that at the city or township clerk's office or a satellite office if the clerk has an additional location. And you also need to provide documents that verify your residency. It could be your driver's license. It could be another document like a bank statement, utility bill. There's a lot of documents you could show, but it has to have your name and address on it. And so that is another safeguard now where if you've missed the registration deadline, you actually have up until Election Day to register to vote. Although if you're doing it within that 14-day period, you do have to do it in person with the clerk. So that helps voters a lot. I mean, we have seen a lot of people registering within those 30 days and within those 14 days who otherwise wouldn't have been able to vote. So it's a real benefit to participation and to voters. That seems to especially help younger people based on the numbers we've seen. And so it does cut down on the number of people who are stopped from participating because they missed the registration deadline. The other benefit of that for election administration purposes is it cuts down on probably the biggest problem at the polling place, which is people showing up not being registered. There's a lot of issues at the polling place, but one of the hardest ones to deal with for poll workers is if someone comes and says, hey, I'm here to vote, their name isn't on the poll book, and then there's a very complicated series of steps that have to be followed to assess what that person's options are. We still have to deal with some of those things, but now we do have this option of if someone shows up and they're not registered, they can go to the clerk's office on election day and register to vote. So that cuts down on a lot of issues involving sort of confusion and provisional ballots and things that take up a lot of stress and time on election day. That has helped a lot in the polling places already. The flip side of that, though, is what this means is clerks, including on election day and throughout that entire 30-day period, have a lot more voter registration work to do. So in the past, once that 30-day period ended, the clerks were mostly done with voter registration. They would still have to deal with some issues like postmark forms coming in or other sort of mistakes or errors that might have happened. But for the most part, in the past, clerks could kind of shift into election preparation mode on day 30. They still need to do that, but now they also have voter registrations coming in. So it has added an increased burden and responsibility on clerks. Also means they need more staff and technology and assistance to do that. So I'm going to touch on that later about how clerks need support, but it is an additional responsibility that does fall primarily on the local clerks to allow voter registration within this 14-day period. So it's great for voters. It helps a lot with a lot of election administration functions, but it absolutely does create a lot of additional responsibilities for clerks leading up to the election. The other big change is the no reason absentee voting, which I have abbreviated here as no reason AV. So before 2018-3, you could vote. Of course, we had absentee ballots, but you had to have a specific reason. So it could be over a certain age, or you had an illness, or you're out of your community. You basically had to fill out a form that said, I need an absentee ballot because I have, A, B, or C excuse to get one. After proposal 2018-3, that's gone. You don't have to give an excuse. If you want to vote an absent voter ballot, you can just do it. I want to vote an absent voter ballot just because I prefer to do it. And that's all you have to say, basically. As long as you're registered to vote and you're eligible and you fill out a signed request, you are able to request an absent voter ballot. What that basically means is absentee voting has kind of gone from a backup plan or an accommodation to just another method of voting that's kind of co-equal with voting in person. The other thing that has come along with that is that you can also request your absent voter ballot either by mail or in person. That was also true in the past, but because there's no reason to give an excuse, you can basically decide any time in the period that you can get an absent voter ballot that, hey, I think I'd like to get my absent voter ballot. I'd like to go down to the clerk's office and pick it up, or I'd like to have it by mail. So it's essentially, and then the other thing I'll mention that was required in proposal 2018-3, even though it's not on the slide here, is that clerks also have to provide some hours on the weekend before the election where they have to be open for the purpose both for people to register to vote, but also to get these absent voter ballots. So that kind of creates a sort of early voting system. The last point I'll make here is that you hear a lot of terms. I just want to mention this because you see people sometimes call this no reason absentee, vote by mail, vote at home, early voting. There are differences between those terms. They don't mean the exact same thing. For example, early voting, sometimes people refer to it as early voting only if you have tabulation before election day, which we don't do in Michigan. The ballots are not actually tabulated in the voting machine until election day. But and there's other distinctions. Some people say vote by mail is actually only if you're like a state like Oregon where everyone just gets mailed a ballot. There are absolutely distinctions here. They're very wonky. If you want to read about them, you can go to the National Council for State Legislatures and other websites. But big picture, when people talk about this in Michigan using any of these terms, that's what we're talking about here. You basically can get a ballot in person or by mail before election day without giving an excuse. So you're probably going to continue to hear all these terms because no one can seem to agree what this should be called. But those are the rules. The other thing that came along with proposal 2018-3 that I just want to mention, because this also impacts clerks, both at the local and county level, is that proposal 2018-3, in addition to giving you the right to get an absent voter ballot by mail or in person, you can get it any time within that 40-day period before election day. So if you've requested your absentee ballot at least 40 days before the election, or if you come in any time within that 40-day period, you have the right to get a ballot pretty much immediately. So if you come in person at the same time, or if you do it by mail, you're supposed to get it by the next day. That has also meant that the deadlines that start before election day really have a direct effect on the clerks and the voters in a way that wasn't as much the case before. Before 2018-3, we had rules about when ballots were supposed to be printed and delivered to clerks' offices, but there wasn't a specific constitutional right to get a ballot on the 40th day before the election. So we did see some differences just in terms of when ballots could be delivered, when they could be tested, and when clerks could make them available. Those sort of logistical, procedural realities are still there. Sometimes we have delays in having ballots printed. Sometimes there might be an error on the ballot that need to be reprinted. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of issues now related to COVID-19 that can make it more difficult to make ballots available. But voters do have a constitutional right under the Michigan Constitution to have access to a ballot, an absent voter ballot, starting 40 days before the election. So, you know, that is something that has been a challenge for a lot of clerks to actually be in a position to provide. And we're working towards solutions there. But it's something that by November, we really have to have figured out statewide to make sure that everyone's able to get those ballots. For military and overseas voters, it's actually day 45. So they even have more time before the election where they have to have their ballot available. That was already actually in the election law and statute, but Proposal 2018-3 put it in the Constitution. So if you're a military or overseas voter, you have the right to that ballot 45 days before the election. It's generally a little easier to get ballots because there's an electronic ballot that can be used, but that's another thing that clerks need to keep in mind, and that we need to keep in mind, which is that if you're overseas, you have to get your ballot 45 days out. Other thing I'll just touch on briefly, because I'm going to mention this a little bit later on when I talk about what townships can do to help out their clerks, is that there actually were some other provisions that don't get as much attention in Proposal 2018-3 involving security and privacy. Proposal 2018-3 gives every voter in Michigan the right to have their election results audited. We did already do some post-election audits in Michigan, and there are actually a lot of really important checks and balances in the system already, including, you know, after the ballots are collected and counted, the county, as a second check, will do a county canvass of the votes, and if there's any kind of mistakes or errors that occurred on election day, the county officials can look at that, and then that's followed by a state canvass. So there actually is, you know, already a lot of safeguards in the system. In addition to that, before Proposal 2018-3, both county clerks and the Bureau of Elections in some cases would also do some kind of random audits and procedural audits to make sure that all the numbers matched up and all the procedures were followed. But that was never a constitutional right. Now it is. So we have been expanding a lot of our auditing procedures and looking at what we could do to have more of a statewide audit system in response to that part of Proposal 2018-3. And that does, in some cases, mean that clerks will have more responsibilities after Election Day, not just up to Election Day. And then I'll just mention also that there's also a right to a secret ballot under 2018-3. You know, that's now in the state constitution, but everyone has that right. So what does this really mean? You know, what were we sort of expecting until March 10th? So we, you know, going into the last 2 years, we had been, you know, spending a lot of time talking to clerks, a lot of time adjusting our procedures and trying to help clerks prepare for what their elections might look like under this new landscape, mostly of voter registration and absentee voting laws. We already knew before COVID that this was going to dramatically change the way our elections worked. We knew that a lot more people were going to decide to vote by mail. You know, we've seen other states make similar changes, and what you typically see is a pretty big boost. It doesn't necessarily always happen right at once, but you do, when you move to no reason absentee voting or some other method of making ballots more available by mail, we typically see a big jump up to 40 or 50%. So whereas in previous elections, we were looking at maybe a quarter or a third, depends a little bit on jurisdiction, of people who would choose to vote by mail. Even pre-COVID, we were expecting to see by November of this year, you know, up to half of the votes cast statewide being by mail. So we were already moving in this direction, but it was kind of a guessing game because you don't really know for sure how many people are going to choose that option. The other thing that we knew was happening, which I touched on before, is on Election Day, because both of the increased absentee voting and because of the ability to register up to Election Day, what this meant was clerks had to spend more of their time and do more of their work in the clerk's office. You know, in a typical election day in past years would have been the clerk and their deputy, if they're fortunate enough to have a deputy, and the senior staff going around, you know, going to polling places, troubleshooting, taking calls, making sure everything is working okay. They still have to do all that, but now they also have to staff the clerk's office because people are able to come in and register to vote, and they're also, you know, have to process more absentee ballots that are coming in on Election Day. So that means that clerks, you know, as they get in the lead up to Election Day, really need to be a little bit more inward focused in terms of their clerk's office and the functions that the clerk's office is providing for absentee voting and for voter registration. As I mentioned, these changes do tend to reduce the problems we see at the polling place, but that doesn't reduce them to zero. There's always issues at the polling place. I mean, even if everything goes perfectly, we see crazy stuff. In March, I think we had a car or a truck go through the wall of the polling place. The clerks did a great job responding to that. I think we had a fire somewhere. So there's always something going on at polling places. Or there may be a problem where a machine's not working. So those things are still happening, and the clerks still need to be able to keep one eye on that. But they have all this responsibility to do on election day. So again, it's another area where Proposal 2018-3 has increased clerk responsibilities and the number of resources they need to allocate. It hasn't taken away any responsibilities. It has helped with some things, but they still have those responsibilities, and they also have new things they have to do. So we were already getting ready for this, and it was already going to be a challenge going into COVID-19. So COVID-19 obviously changed everything. The first case, I mean, I remember this vividly. I'm not sure that people who aren't directly involved in elections would as much, but it was actually on election night on March 10th for a presidential primary when the first case was reported of COVID-19. So in Michigan, that is, and it wasn't a shock that it was here because we had seen it in other states, so it was probably only a matter of time. But we had not had any reported cases in Michigan. We had our March 10th primary. It went relatively smoothly. It was our first major election with all these new voting laws in place, and our clerks did an excellent job. We had a high turnout. We didn't have very many huge problems, so we were sort of getting ready to breathe a sigh of relief and hopefully get a little bit of sleep. And then, that night is when we found out the first case of COVID-19 was in Michigan. So that basically since March 10th, we've been totally in a new world, mostly for worse. We've been in a new world where we have to figure out how we're going to continue to hold elections in Michigan, and same thing that other states are dealing with too. So what has that meant for us? Well, it's been a lot of big changes. One thing that absolutely is the case everywhere in the country, including in Michigan, is that more people are going to vote by mail. It's kind of a no-brainer. People are going to either vote in person or they're going to vote by mail for the most part. So, if you don't want people crowding at the polling place, if you don't want lines, if you don't want people in condensed areas, the only other real option is to have more people voting by mail. So just in the same way that everyone else is doing more things remotely, we knew that that we were going to have more voting by mail. What exactly that's going to look like in August, November, we're not totally sure. In May, we had a very unique election, which I'm sure a lot of you remember if you had elections in your jurisdiction, where we basically had an executive order that changed all the rules temporarily for our May elections. Instead of having traditional polling places, we had just one voting location open, or at least one voting location open in each jurisdiction, with the vast majority of people voting by mail. It was a huge change. We mailed everyone an absentee ballot application with postage prepaid return. We put postage prepaid on the ballots coming back. The clerks did an unbelievable job, and I'm basically having to do an entirely new system in a month in the middle of a pandemic. And we were able to have an election where up to 90, we're not exactly sure how everything was coded, but it looked like, based on the numbers we saw, that about 99% of people voted either by mail or they put their ballot in a drop box. So, the voters took to it very quickly. The other thing that happened, which was kind of amazing, is that our typical May turnout is usually around 12 or 13%. And in May of this year, we ended up having about 25% turnout. So, there are a lot of reasons for that. I think mailing everyone an application probably, clued some people in who frankly didn't know there was an election going on. Maybe people were sitting home with nothing else to do. But for whatever reason, we ended up having about double turnout in our May elections, almost all by mail. And this was an incredible achievement by our local clerks. So, that was May. We're not doing that again for August. In August, we're kind of moving back towards a bit more, basically a normal election. We don't have any real special rules in place, but we're still continuing this trend of seeing a lot of people voting by mail. In August already, we have 1.8 million absent voter ballots that have been issued. If you compare that to overall turnout in 2016, August was only 1.4 million. So we've already got more ballots out than everyone who voted in 2016. Our turnout in August 2018, which was record high turnout for an August election in Michigan, was 2.2 million. So we're already starting to push towards that. And that 2.2 million included in-person voting, mostly in-person voting. So we're seeing, a continuation of a trend in May, even though the polling places are fully open. We're still seeing, I think the vast majority of people are going to end up voting by mail. If I had to guess, I'd say probably around 90%. But we're going to end up having people voting by mail in this August election. That is sort of a continuation of a trend, even though the rules are different. In terms of November, who knows? I mean, we'll see what the world's like. Hopefully we'll be in a better place with COVID, but I think at this point, we should expect to see most people voting by mail, both in August and November. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind for August is, unlike May, in May there were in-person options, but in August, all of our polling places are open and all the in-person registration opportunities are still there. So whereas in May, clerks were able to, unbelievably difficult circumstances, clerks were able to focus mostly on the mail aspect of this. They're still doing that, but now we still have to staff polling places. So we have to keep in mind all of the polling places that are usually open are still going to be open on election day, with poll workers, with voting machines, with all the other things you need to have to set up a polling place. We also, and then also in addition to that, people going into clerk's offices, as I mentioned, you're still able to go in person to register or request an absent voter ballot in the lead up to the election. So those are still things that clerks have to do. With both of these things, I am optimistic that the shift to voting by mail is going to reduce the number of people who are going to be doing this in person, but it's still going to happen and the clerks have to be ready for it. So all of those things have to be done in a safe way. And so, a lot of these, a lot of locations, especially in smaller jurisdictions, you don't necessarily have a lot to choose from in terms of voting locations. You may only have one building, you may have the township building or a church. That might be your options basically in terms of a polling place. So a lot of these things aren't necessarily designed for having social distancing, having things spaced out. And although it is possible to get, generally the basics in terms of PPE, in terms of masks and gloves and cleaning supplies, it's still difficult. Even if they're available, there's a distribution challenge because we have, in addition to 1,520 local clerks, we have about 5,000 precincts, which translates to at least 4,000 polling places. I believe that's right. So we have a lot of places we have to get this equipment distributed across the state. And so to guarantee a safe in-person voting and registration experience is a challenge. The other thing is that, staffing is definitely a challenge. You may be seeing some reporting on this in the news, and that's why I'm going to hand it off to Sally in a couple minutes to talk about poll workers. But, a lot of our poll workers, as folks know, and election officials as well, they may be more elderly or otherwise in a higher risk group where understandably they may not want to be working right now. And so, there's a need to get replacement staff. You can't replace experienced staff, but just getting people in there to work in the first place is something of a challenge. Even when staff are working, there's a lot of other challenges. The township building might be closed. People might be furloughed partially. They may not have access to all of the vendor equipment that they usually do. So even when they're able to work, they still have these challenges, in terms of actually being able to do their job. And then, of course, we're all facing this. I know that, township officials certainly understand this, that, trying to work, trying to provide public service and do your job while, you have responsibilities at home or otherwise that you may not normally have because of the pandemic is extremely difficult. So election workers are dealing with this as well. So this is just a plug to please reach out and give a call to your local clerk and election staff because, there are many people who are doing difficult work in these times and are very difficult circumstances, but they're definitely near the top in terms of the hardest job to have right now. So, they're trying to adjust to all these new situations under very difficult circumstances. We have gotten some help at the federal level, and the state has been facilitating distribution of that. We got, through the CARES Act, about $11.7 million for Michigan to help election functions. We've allocated most of that to the localities to support all the stuff they need to do. When you have more people voting by mail, it means you need more envelopes to mail ballots. You're going to need additional equipment like automatic letter openers, folding equipment. You may need to print more ballots. You may need to purchase, additional things for postage. You may need additional staff. And then, of course, safety and hygiene supplies. So we've allocated most of that through and then I should also mention, you also are going to need more voting machines. So a lot of clerks are now investing in high-speed scanners to count ballots, or an additional tabulator to help them deal with the volume of ballots that are coming in. So we have allocated most of this money to help local jurisdictions purchase these things. And then we've also distributed personal protective equipment in the form of masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, cleaning equipment, and face shields to the jurisdictions. The counties have helped us. We basically send it to the counties and they pass it on to the local jurisdictions. But we've, been able to allocate the majority of this federal money both to facilitating more voting by mail and providing safety and hygiene supplies. And then I'll just mention that localities may have additional CARES money to support local functions that you can also allocate towards elections, which I would encourage you to do. So how can the townships help? Well, I'm going to pick up again on the funding point. This is a constant issue. I'm sure that you hear it from your local clerks, but it's true. They are right. Local clerks need more funding for elections. I completely understand, the financial situation we're in right now at the state level, federal level, local level is difficult. And I understand that the budget situation is tight, but both in the short term and the long term, the vast majority of local jurisdictions do need to allocate more resources to elections. A lot of local officials, like, they do an amazing job of just getting by on what they have. They're very scrappy, they're very creative, but at a certain point, you do get what you pay for. So you really need to find a way to fund elections. I mentioned that federal funding, we do sometimes get chunks of money from the federal level through the Help America Vote Acts or from some of this sort of special security money. Sometimes we're able to get funding from the state. We did get some money from the state legislature last year that helped. But these are really like one-time kind of injections of capital. They're not meant to, and they cannot sustain election functions. So funding is just a critical need. There's no other way to say it. If funding can't be provided, or in addition to funding, I should say, there's also ways you can help your clerks by making the township infrastructure and staffing, whatever it is, available, make it fully available so that clerks can benefit from it before and on election day. And then the final point, which Sally will talk about, is just the poll worker recruitment. You can really help use your platform and your connections in the community to help get poll workers signed up, because we need a lot more of those. So I mentioned this already sort of on the previous slide, but I'll just emphasize that, as I mentioned at the beginning, local clerks do the vast majority of election work in the state, and that means they need the vast majority of the resources. Clerks, we've been able to provide some federal funding that's helped, but there's certainly not enough to completely transform the way we run our elections in a pandemic or over the long term. I'm hopeful that maybe we'll get some more federal support, but we really need consistent, ongoing investment in election infrastructure at the local level. What I would focus on, and I'm not I'm certainly not an expert on local budgeting, but I would really work with your clerks, listen to them, and think about planning investments that can improve the efficiency and the function of elections over the long term. There are things that will definitely pay off. Things like equipment that can help the clerks process mail ballots more quickly, high-speed scanners to deal with ballots. If you can, in some places, clerks have had very good experiences working with vendors that can actually help them mail out their ballots or mail out their applications. These are some things that may have, a little bit more of an outlay early on, but they do pay off, and, you're paying for it one way or another. So to try to sort of do some of these things that can be handled more efficiently through a patchwork, sort of case-by-case basis is very difficult. So I would really encourage you to think about some long-term investments. I know right now is not the best time to ask that, but it's just the reality that it's necessary. The other thing, though, that can happen right now, regardless of whether you can allocate funding, is just make sure that you are doing everything you can at the township level to make your full infrastructure and resources available for elections. So, that can be as simple as, making sure that the township clerk has what they need. Are they able to get into the building? Whatever, and I know this varies, very much from township to township. You might have a very sophisticated, large township hall with multiple floors, or you might have nothing in terms of a township building. But whatever that is, make sure that, whether it's an infrastructure or a vendor contract or anything else, the township clerk can access that for their election functions. The other thing that you want to do is make sure that your other township officials, including law enforcement, whatever your data professionals are, whether that's whether you have an in-house IT person or whether you have a vendor, make sure that they're involved in your planning so that you have an election security plan or an emergency response plan in case something unexpected happens on election day. And then this is one thing that I really strongly encourage, is to the extent you can on election day, and that includes August 4th, try to shut down or limit everything else that's going on in your township on election day. If you can have it closed or very limited for any purpose other than elections, if you can limit your other township services for anything other than elections on election day, that is a great thing to do. It really helps the clerk have full access to your resources. And you can also make your staff available then if they're normally doing something else to help work for the clerk. The clerks regularly report that some of the best poll workers they have or deputy clerks they have are other municipal officials or staff. So anything you can to just make election day about elections only. Obviously you still need to have the fire department working, but whatever you can limit, try to do that to the extent possible. Certainly November, but on August 4th as well. Try to make that all available to them. So that's the last one I have, and I'm going to hand it off to Sally. I think I'll just emphasize, there's a lot of ways, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. I think that, we're seeing very different experiences. Obviously, depending on the extent of COVID and what part of the state you're in, if you're in a larger township that's bigger than most cities in Michigan, or if you're in a very small township, you're obviously going to have very different resources and different experiences. But there's definitely something you can do at the township level to support your clerks, and they really need as much support as they can get right now. So on these last points, whether it's making more funding available, or whether it's just sharing their infrastructure, or just making sure you're communicating about what's available, so they're not out there on their own. Anything you can do to help them will help the clerks directly, and it will also help your voters have a better in-person voting experience. So happy to answer any questions. I'm going to hand it off to Sally now to talk about the last piece of this, which you can also help with, but I really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks again, everyone, for being here. I'll really quickly just talk about poll worker recruitment a bit more. And so just for context, our office at the Department of State, we launched a poll worker recruitment initiative back in the spring of this year, because we started hearing from clerks all across the state, from large municipalities to smaller townships, that they were concerned about having enough poll workers, enough election workers to staff their polling places and their counting boards to process ballots on election day. As Jonathan mentioned, with the increase in mail-in voting and the fact that we still have to maintain polling places and have those open to the public, it means more people than ever before. It's really one of the best ways you can help your local election officials is help them have the people and the staff that they need. And so we have this recruitment campaign. If you'd like to participate with us, we would love to hear from you, and our contact information is on a later slide. But already 4,500 people have expressed interest through this initiative. And the important thing to note, like Jonathan said, is you can contact your clerk, your local township clerk, to see how they're doing and see what their needs are and see how you can help them get people, whether it's business leaders in your community, whether it's people in your township staff, whether it's teachers and students at your local school, civic organizations, really any group that is potentially community minded and really wants to make a difference on election day, they can make a difference. And your voice, your help in recruiting those people for your local clerk will be incredibly important, both for August and for November. So I highly encourage you after this session to pick up the phone and call your clerk, or send them an email and see how they're doing and see if there's something that you can do to help. Jonathan, if you want to go to the previous slide, I'll just mention our contact information. So any clerk on this call who needs help, who needs additional poll workers, please email Colleen Garrity from our team, and she will make sure that we can try to direct people your way who we're recruiting from all different channels all across the state. And then similarly, any township leadership who's on this call right now, if you want to play a more active role in promoting this opportunity to your residents, please email me. My email address is there on the screen. I'll put it in the chat box as well. But don't hesitate to reach out. It's really everybody can do something to help, and I think Jonathan's points really outline that as well. So happy to answer any more questions you all might have, but that's really the gist of it. And so we're recruiting people for both August and November.
So that concludes what we had for you, but I understand there may be some questions, and I just want to thank you all again for taking the time to let us speak with you, and we really appreciate all this work you're doing. I understand as well, I'll just mention, we see it from an election side, but we know that township officials are dealing with a whole litany of other things too. So we understand you're under pressure and difficult circumstances right now. We really appreciate everything you're doing as well.
Yes, thank you, you guys. Very, very informative presentation. We have gotten a couple of questions, but before we get into those questions, just kind of want to start back at the beginning where we talked about voter registration. Some of the feedback, and I see it here in some of the questions that are coming through, is because we are registering more voters, because we are processing more AV ballots, all of that is increasing the workload on the local level clerk. It may have made the system more efficient, but for example, like some of the questions that have come through are talking about the signatures, how difficult it is to verify the signatures and how the system works through that registration process with verifying those signatures. So can you speak to the issue, those types of issues?
Yeah, I mean, again, it has definitely put more of a burden on the clerks to do more. I mean, the process of signature verification is something that has always been an important check in our system that's still there. So, when you register to vote, you provide a signature either on a registration form, or we use your signature from your driver's license or state ID. And then, based on whatever the signature that's available, the clerks then are using that to verify both the absent voter ballot application and the absent voter ballot envelope when it comes in. It's also checked on, when you sign the poll book when you go in to vote, if you're voting in person. So, there needs to be sufficient time for the clerks to actually, have the ability to do those processes, which are necessary and also important safeguards in our system. We have been putting out some additional training materials to try to help clerks have better standards for how they can apply those things. But at a certain point, it does become a person power issue. I mean, you can only do so much with the staff you have. And so I think that underscores, some of the things that, some of the things we're talking about, frankly, about getting more volunteers and more staff in. So there's not just one person or one experienced person who we're relying on to do that kind of verification. It's also, we're looking at some things that other states have done too. There are some states that use like technology to review signatures. We don't really do that yet in Michigan, although we're seeing some jurisdictions start to look at it, to at least, if not review the signatures, to at least put them in a format that they can be looked at more efficiently. So, we're exploring that. Obviously, this has been a fast change in Michigan, so we're not there yet in terms of having all that technology available, but we definitely are looking at other states and seeing what we can do to make the process more efficient for our clerks. But there's no way around it that it's just a lot more work to do. And if you have one person or two people that now have to do 2 or 3 times the amount of work with the same amount of resources, like, you can only do so much. So that's where we really just, part of it is just we need to find a way to provide more support to them.
Right, and so then the next question, they've come in several different ways, is and you guys acknowledged it about getting the poll workers, maybe difficult to find the poll workers because of the COVID-19 that we're dealing with right now. We do have the initiative program out there that you talked about, but there's still a lot of other logistics I think that the township board needs to understand in terms of whether or not their office is even open. A lot of township clerks work from home and don't work out of an office. What kind of suggestions does the Bureau have in terms of their offices being open, being staffed for this voter registration and AV ballot processing, and if they are having trouble finding those poll workers? I know I'm lumping a bunch of questions into one here, but in terms of finding those poll workers, what if they refuse to wear masks? The mask question, is very prominent right now.
Yeah, so I'll try to go through those. Those are all difficult questions, but important questions. So in terms of infrastructure, I think it's important to understand, and this has been in the governor's executive orders and just is a nationwide reality, is that election work is critical infrastructure. So it's designated by the Department of Homeland Security, the Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency. It is a designation of critical infrastructure. So that means that election work needs to continue even in emergency situations. So election officials need to be able to continue to do their jobs. So it cannot be the case that, they can't be prevented from doing that work. It needs to continue. And we have elections whether or not we're in an emergency situation or not. So that doesn't mean that Township Hall needs to be open all the time to the general public. But if there are limitations on who can get into the building, townships do need to work with the clerk to figure out a way that the clerk can continue and their staff can continue to operate. And I think there's different ways to do that. If the building is going to be closed to the general public, I think you can still, for example, the Bureau of Elections, our state government is closed to the public, but we have appointment hours. We put information on our website and phone number where if people need to come in, they can make appointments and come in. So that's a model that can work. The key is if voters do need to come in, to register or to vote or to apply for absentee voter ballots, or if clerks need to be in there to do their work, there needs to be a way that can happen, even if generally the building's closed. And if it affects voters, it's really important to share that information on the township website, on their social media page, on their phone message, however you communicate with voters. It's important, or the community or constituents in general, it's important to make sure that information is available. It doesn't mean that you can't have limited hours or different hours, but you do need to have some availability for voters to have access. And under the Michigan Constitution, that does need to include 8 hours the weekend before Election Day. I think the next question was having to do with poll workers. I think, so there's a couple things there. One, there is the executive order on masks, 153. That exempts, it says that you are required to wear a mask if you're inside. Basically, I'm oversimplifying it. But if you have an excuse, like you can't medically tolerate a mask, you don't have to wear one. The way that makes it into how poll workers work is basically, there's the state law, which then gets filtered through your local employment policies. So, I can't tell you how to set your local employment policies for poll workers, but those generally do need to comply with the law. So if poll workers are in there, they're subject to the same basic requirement that anyone else who's inside or working would be subject to. Now, when it comes to, and again, there may be exceptions, like if they medically can't tolerate it or it's a disability issue, you have to work through those things. When it comes to voters, the executive order does expressly say that if you are in a polling place for the purpose of voting, that you're strongly encouraged to vote, but you can't be required to, of course you're strongly encouraged to vote. You're strongly encouraged to wear a mask, but you can't be prevented from voting. You can't be required to wear a mask. So there does need to be a process to let someone who isn't wearing a mask vote. We've shared some materials with the local clerks on signage that basically explains this, like you're strongly encouraged to vote, to wear a mask. If you're not wearing one, there's other options like voting curbside. But there is a provision that says that you don't have to wear a mask if you're voting. And so I think a lot of that is just going to be, handling situations as they come, trying to handle it as safely as possible, not escalate anything and just get the voter process through. And then I think I answered all the questions there, but if I didn't, let me know.
Yeah, so I'm just going to follow up on the one where you were talking about the poll workers refusing to wear the mask. I couldn't agree with you more. They are a type of employee of the township. Maybe even in the application process, you may want to ask them at that point if they're willing to wear a mask. Those that are not willing, maybe people that you don't want to appoint as election workers. How does the Bureau feel about the shields versus the mask? I don't personally know, so you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I should say at the outset, we're not a public health authority. I don't have any public health expertise, so I cannot give you any advice on what is medically appropriate. We have shared through our guidance with the clerks what the governor's office has said and what the CDC has said. The executive order requires wearing a face covering, a cloth face covering. But we've also provided face shields because, those may be preferred. There may be situations where someone can't wear a cloth covering, but they could wear a face shield, in which case the face shield could provide a benefit there. Some election workers may prefer to wear a face shield in addition to a cloth face covering. So we're trying to provide as many options as possible. But, in terms of the specific what's better or what's safer, that's where we really have to defer just to the authorities on this. So, certainly consult the governor's website, the CDC, and then of course the local and county health authorities can supplement that, because, there may not necessarily be a totally uniform policy across the state in terms of what the local officials are recommending or requiring. But we've tried to provide as much resources as we can so that there's as many options as possible.
Right. And so there were several questions that kind of focused around that funding issue. I know you talked about the CARES Act and the funding for that. I think that, townships understand that their three statutory responsibilities are taxation, assessing, and elections, and therefore elections need to be fully funded. It would be great to get funding through the state or the federal government to help out with these supplies that weren't originally anticipated in the budget. However, there does seem to be some concern in these questions about not receiving the supplies on time, those that have been available at the state level. So I'm sure the answer to that is they need to do what they need to do to run their elections and provide that PPE material. But will there be any kind of reimbursement if they do have to purchase things that could later be covered under that funding?
So there's a few different ways that we've been able to distribute resources, and so it kind of depends. I mean, we have sent masks, gloves, cleaning equipment, hand sanitizer, and face shields directly out. So they've been distributed almost everywhere. I think there may be one or two counties that haven't gotten them yet. But the model we're using there is we're distributing them to the counties, and the counties are working with the local officials to get them out to local officials. We'll then need to get them distributed to the precincts. We have packaged them in like precinct-specific bags, so it should be fairly easy to divide them up, although the actual process of getting them distributed is still going to be an extra thing to do. So if clerks haven't gotten that yet, they should check in with their county clerk, but if the county clerk hasn't got it yet, they should be getting it very soon. In terms of the other supplies, we also set up basically a purchase order that local clerks could use to purchase supplies through a state contract that we had with some vendors like Staples and Office Depot. The reason we structured it that way basically was that it means that the local jurisdictions don't have to deal with all the paperwork to use the federal money. We are pushing them to get everything that was ordered delivered before August 4th. We are, as those of you who deal with vendors all the time will understand, we often get a lot of, well, we can't do this, we can't do that. So we're talking to them daily and trying to make sure they get everything they can out by August 4th. We've also said that, or before August 4th, we need it before then. But we've also said that, we've tried to share as much information as possible about what we can provide. We haven't said that, you'll definitely be able to get everything you need from us. So we have been telling local jurisdictions to assess their own needs and try to get what they can on their own, and we're trying to supplement it as much as possible. So we are talking for those jurisdictions that haven't gotten what they ordered yet, we're trying to get it out to them as soon as possible, and the stuff that we're delivering directly, we definitely will have it in time for election day. We don't have a specific reimbursement program right now to answer your last question, we don't have a specific reimbursement now for additional purchases, but if we can make more funding available, it's certainly something that we'll look at.
Great, thank you. And then I think I have one last question that will summarize several that have come in. Actually, one I hadn't really heard of myself yet, although it seems quite interesting. I have gotten several questions about limiting the number of people that can be in the precinct at a time to vote. And my suggestion for that was, well, like we go to the grocery store and you have X's on the floor, if you're moving forward in 6 feet increments, that in itself is going to limit the amount of people that are in the precinct. So there's that. And then, but what I've just seen here in one of the questions is curbside voting. Have you heard anybody who's asked about curbside voting?
Yeah, we have gotten a lot of questions about that because, typically it's been used in limited circumstances. I mean, typically curbside voting has been offered as an accommodation for voters with disabilities, who may have trouble accessing the polling place. We saw in May clerks had some very creative solutions to offer voting outside. Some clerks sort of set up kind of like a drive-through voting situation, or expand their curbside voting. It does require, additional. It does require additional work to set up a curbside voting situation. So it's not necessarily something you can rely on as your primary method of voting unless you have enough staff and equipment to really have an outdoor voting situation. Typically, it does require, because it's designed as an assistive method of voting, it typically does require you to have at least 2 election inspectors who can go out and assist the person in receiving their ballot. So, it's sort of designed as something that can be an additional option for voters who prefer not to come in. And we have gotten questions about it, and we're looking at if we can provide any more detail in our guidance on how it would work in practice. But it's certainly something that would be easier to do, frankly, with sufficient staffing and if there's not a lot of crowding in the polling place. So, our hope is that the flow of voters will be such that it's possible to provide those accommodations easily. We understand, though, it's going to be difficult to run polling places, and that certainly includes curbside voting.
Right, and like you had mentioned earlier, limiting their other services so that you might be able to use entry and exit doors that you normally wouldn't have used, maybe going through an office because the regular staff are not in there at that time. Those are really great ideas. I guess the only last thing that's come up repetitively, I know I said that was the last question, but I'm going to ask one more. And that is when the election workers, don't show up or fall out of the process up to election day after the election commission has already appointed them and possibly appointed alternatives in that event that you get in an emergency situation. But what are the options? I do know that in the statute, it does allow the local clerk to appoint an election worker in an emergency type of situation, which I think would include all of those scenarios. But if you could please confirm that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And frankly, our election law doesn't really contemplate a situation like this, where you're just not able to get people. That's just candidly, there's not a clear, hey, there's a pandemic, what do you do if people drop out the last second? So one thing that we're trying to do to get out ahead of that is, that's why the Democracy MP program and other recruitment efforts are so important, to try to get, not just the minimum number, but hopefully some extras and some reserves that you can deploy if people drop out. So the first step is to try to get everyone signed up as soon as possible. Yes, you can still continue to appoint people through the emergency process up through election day. You can do it, but as much as possible, we recommend that you mirror the process that you would to hire them normally. So, if you can at least train them, get them hired as soon as possible out before election day, the sooner the better. Even if it's not that typical, election board meeting where you do it 20 days ahead of time, if you can at least just have that, something that mirrors that process where you're getting people signed up and trained, that's better. In a last resort, yeah, you can still use the emergency procedure on election day. And, you can even have a voter who's coming in to vote and say, hey, we really need help. Can you stick around and work? That's an option. But the more that you can do before election day to get out in front of that, the better. And we are going to, between now and election day, be providing a little bit more guidance on sort of worst case scenarios and what you can do in those situations. But it is a situation where, as I said, it's not like there is a clear provision in the election law other than that emergency provision for situations like this.
Correct. And I guess I would just ask that through the audit process too, because I believe that is one of the questions on the audit, the election commission appointing the election poll workers, as well as making sure they have an application filled out, that the Bureau understandably realizes that there's going to be these emergencies, and probably the best solution will be to fully document what procedures you had to take and the reason you needed to in the event that your precinct is audited.
And
okay.
Cindy, if I can just jump in really quickly and just add that, if right now that you don't have enough poll workers to fully staff your polling places on election day, if you know that you have this issue, don't hesitate to let us at the Department of State and the Bureau of Elections know, so that we can try our best to direct people your way and try to help you. You know, we'd love to support, to try to support you in these next couple of days and weeks.
Great. And then lastly, somebody put on there, not really a question, but a comment, and they said, clerks rock. And I would agree with that. And so with that, I think we can wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us again, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you.